In August 2024, it was Bangladesh, and in September 2025, it was Nepal.
And they want to control us just like a dictator.
Young, angry men taking control of streets, burning and looting, public and private property, without any fear of police or the bullets. In Bangladesh, more than 400 died before. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, a strong ally of India, realized that her hand-picked army chief was not ready to defend her anymore and fled to the safety of New Delhi. In Nepal, the pro-Chinese Prime Minister Sharma Oli was more human. Within 48 hours of riots and with 19 dead, he tendered his resignation to the president. Behind scenes, he was asked by the army chief, General Ashok Raj Sigdal, to leave. Script of this change in many ways was a photocopy of what happened in Bangladesh. But with one major difference: it was India that lost in Bangladesh, and it's China that has lost Nepal to India. But most in Pakistan are not interested in these fine points. They wonder why such a change has not happened in Pakistan, where a brutal regime supported by the military has ruled a nation of 250 million with increasing use of tyranny. What makes Pakistan different? Why Pakistani people have an endless tolerance for political abuse? Why repeated mass protests have fizzled out without any positive change? Moeed Pirzada, editor GVS, invites Dr. Hussein Nadeem of George Washington University and Eric Sperling, executive director, Just Foreign Policy, to grapple with this question.
So is the fall of a pro-Chinese government of the Prime Minister Oli will be seen as a victory in Washington?
There is so much in play between India, China, and the United States. It also has significant geopolitical implications for the region.
You have a very specific set of elite that has done a very deep elite capture.
Or what happened in Nepal is just the internal organic change.
So I think that does signal something. Very, gifted set of organizers.
I like the term, gifted set of organizers. I mean, what do you exactly mean by that?
India, China, the West, they all have some interest there.
So they keep on throwing up the specter of conflict with India, the insurgency in Balochistan, the threat from Afghanistan, there's a threat in Fatah, so that, the people are always worried about the survival of the state.
Anytime you are faced with a chaos, what do? You don't solve it. You create another chaos and another chaos and another chaos. That really, the veil lifted when the military came into clash with Imran Khan, expecting exactly the same kind of response that people would, be grateful and thankful. Well, that didn't really happen.
And if you have to accept change in Pakistan, sooner or later, within the next few years,
President Donald Trump seems to be pivoting away from India and is pivoting towards Pakistan.
Especially when you look at the type of promises that the Pakistani regime has made, which are not serious promises. They're going to sound good to someone like Trump, who's...
Assalamu alaikum, this is Moeed Pirzada in Washington. In this session, I'm joined by Dr. Hussein Nadeem from George Washington University and by Eric Sperling, who is the founder, executive director of the Just Foreign Policy. We are going to start looking at a very interesting development in South Asia, where the Nepalese government of Prime Minister Sharma Oli has suddenly fallen within the last 48 hours to what has been described as the Generation Z, protests by the Generation Z, though there are many interesting undertones to the whole development. I will start by asking this question to both of my participants. Eric Sperling, if we start from you, how are you looking at this change in Nepal?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways it's a very, obviously can be in some ways inspiring, but then I think also turn to troubling violence that even at the protest organizers were trying to tamp down. But I think it also has significant geopolitical implications for the region, with Nepal being a country that's very much seen as a bit in flux between, being closer to China and being closer to India. So, I think on one hand, it's inspirational for those who want to see change, which I know many of your viewers are interested in how to make change. But also, I think indicates, there can be, other factors at play, as there often is when it comes to the geopolitics in the region, particularly now, where there is so much in play between India, China, and the United States.
So, Eric, I mean, just if I ask you a counter question, do you think it is just the protests by the Generation Z or something else has been happening? On Monday, in an unusual move, in a very strong language, the embassies of United States, UK, France, Japan, and many other Western countries came up very strongly in favor of the protesters and said their rights have to be respected. Do you think there is an international play, or what happened in Nepal is just the internal organic change?
Well, I think in virtually every single one of these protest movements, I think nobody could ever deny that there are legitimate feelings behind it. That can never be manufactured, and people who suggest it's manufactured, that's never the case. I mean, there's always genuine sentiment there. But I think those of us who have studied different causes and how quickly, Western powers respond and the tone they use, I think all three of us here have probably spent an unfortunate amount of time studying those types of comments. And I've definitely studied it also, across regional contexts. And so I think that does signal something. And I think, we've seen in the Pakistan case that the really, incredible protest movements have gotten very little attention. So I think it can signal something, particularly with kind of the sense that the Nepalese government, recent government, was more aligned with China in a way that was not common. And when I study the protest movement as well, I mean, it's a very impressively organized protest movement. If you go to their Twitter page, it just seems very well done, and that can be, of course, a result of a very gifted set of organizers. But it can also be something that
I like the term gifted set of organizers. I mean, what do you exactly mean by that? Some very gifted set of organizers.
Yeah, well, people obviously, people who may inspire their followers, people who may have found good mechanisms of communication with their followers. That's all stuff that we like, right? That even any pro-democracy movement or pro-accountability movement wants to have. But, I think in every setting, there can be times, I've seen this in other contexts too, where the protest movement is so effective that actually the context that they're in, they're actually way more effective than everyone else in the space. And I think that is something that can happen when you have, when people are able to import lessons from other experiences around the world, which can be done in an organic way, or it can be done in a less organic way with, people who have some sort of interest in that, in an outcome. In this case, I think it's pretty clear. I doubt anyone would deny that, India, China, the West, they all have some interest there. I don't think anyone would deny that. What I'm not going to say is to what extent, I don't think anyone could say to what extent that was a role, but it's something to note, how quickly the West responds, how organized and impressive the movement is, how immediately successful they are, how much more effective they are than the very entity that they're protesting. When the entity they're protesting seems like it's from another era, and the protesters are just so sharp and so savvy, it's always interesting to note. So that's what struck me about.
Okay, let me bring Hossein into it. Dr. Hossein, how are you looking at the situation in Nepal?
I think it follows much of what Eric has said. I echo that, but there are other elements that I want to discuss as well, which includes, this being a new manifestation of an emerging trend that has already been there for the past years, I would say, not just like last year, but for years. And I'll break down those trends in 3Ds, basically. And I want to share some data with that because the data will, illuminate a lot of things that are happening and will give a lot of sense to it. The first D is really demography. If you look at the median age in Nepal, in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and even Pakistan, much of the crisis is because the median age is under 30. And there is 62%, in the case of Pakistan, actually, 67% of the country is under the age of 30. And for Sri Lanka, it's about 62. For Bangladesh, it's about 60. And for Nepal, it's about 55 to 58%. Now, that's a youth bulge that we're talking about. Now, the next D is the digitalization. So if you look at what's happened in the past 15 years in this specific region, the digital integrations, the adaptability, the decentralized social media networks, they have empowered the first D, which is the demographics. So the demographics and the second part is the digitalization has created a new power center, which the older generation and those in the governments haven't really realized that the centralized power structures and the power over narratives have kind of been diluted and devolved down to the masses, which is now the younger lot. And the third D is even more interesting, which is the element of, I like to call it dinosaurs, but I'll call it democracy because in a way that will capture the essence of it. But if you look at the past since 2008, uh, Nepal had about 14 government changes. And none of the government actually completed its tenure. So the state of democracy in across these countries, if you look at Hasina Wajid, if you look at Sri Lanka, if you look at Pakistan, if you look at Nepal, now the difference between is India, where there has been a cycle of change and the completeness of government, which is why India has been able to allow itself to grow out of this thing. It hasn't been, shocked by this.
But Hussain, Hasina Wajid was sitting in Bangladesh for 15 long years, from 2009
Yeah.
to 2000.
Which exactly is the state of democracy is being trampled through a prolonged period of individual who had, kind of like a dictatorial way of running the show, right? So in that sense, if you look at it, there are very clear patterns that are there.
Right.
That this region, and I'm going to talk specifically about this region, South Asia, it is completely changing because of the drivers that I talked about, the youth, the element of digitalization. It has created new power centers. So the way I see it, I think these forces are at play, which is now, creating a sort of a wedge between the older power structures and the new power structures. And that's, creating the issue.
But Hussain, there's a very interesting thing. You mentioned Bangladesh and Hasina. In case of Bangladesh and Hasina being kicked out and running to India, you see that Bangladesh, it looks as if some power, either the people or some power, the students or some external power, has kicked out India, that was the governing power in Bangladesh. And in case of Nepal, it looks like that China has been kicked out of Nepal and India emerges victorious in Nepal. How do you look at this equation?
So I think Eric rightly pointed this out, and I think he articulated it in a very good way, that foreign powers always have interest. They will have interest in even, empty islands. Well, they fight over the empty islands, by the way, all the time. South China Sea and elsewhere. So naturally, with countries like, where you're geostrategically located, Muslim countries, most of the times in Bangladesh, and places of, interest for China, there will be contestation. But there are, different variations of that contestation. It's not that any of these countries represent the core strategic interest. But so let's say, for instance, if there are genuine grievances down in the population, the real, I think, questions within the State Department and the White House is that should we ride this tide or should we oppose it? Because opposing the tide is something that you have to do really, really get into it. For instance, in the case of Pakistan, they chose to oppose the tide. Now that requires a lot of muscle, willpower, and manufacturing of consent within the US government. So in the case of these other countries, they don't have particularly want to invest that much in there, and they allow themselves to ride the tide because the stakes are low. So I would say that there are interests. I would say 20-30%. There is always external interest, but a lot of these movements are domestic and locally driven.
So you think a lot of, it's interesting, Eric, when you basically say that the protesters look very well organized, very well guided. Every time something like that happens, when the change came in Bangladesh, there was a lot of shouting and uproar in Pakistan that why such a thing is not happening in Pakistan, where there is much more tyranny. Well, of course, Bangladesh had a lot of tyranny. In case of Nepal, probably there wasn't much of a tyranny, there wasn't much of an abuse as compared to Pakistan. But such a change hasn't really happened in Pakistan. In fact, all attempts of the people to come on the streets have actually been crushed. So what do you think from your American perspective, sitting in Washington, what do you think is the difference between Bangladesh and Nepal and Pakistan?
Yeah, well, and I don't want to claim to be an expert on the domestic dynamics. I'm definitely looking at it from a U.S. lens, but I know both of you are experts in the domestic dynamics. But from my perspective, one thing that was incredibly notable tracking what I thought was an incredibly impressive protest movement, caravan, removing blockades and making its way towards the protest site. I mean, it was really a story that was just could have been made for TV. I've watched many protests like that over the last I would say, over 20 years, 25 years of my life at this point, where the U.S. media is tracking a protest movement. People like my mother would be cooking dinner. She's learning about the protest movement. And somehow that did not happen at all with these amazing protests, even though we're not talking about some dictator. We're talking about Imran Khan, who's one of the more famous athletes in the world, who's a star and who's, people could disagree with him, but he's certainly a likable person. And somehow that didn't happen. So to me, that was the biggest challenge, just from the international perspective, is there was no narrative. And then, there were issues there. Things could have been done, I think, from the protest organizers to get that narrative out. And I did feel that the regime was much more effective in that way. So, that is the one thing that at least I focus on, is that lack of that narrative being created, because once that narrative is created, that can build momentum in the Western capitals. Then they start to comment, then that energizes the protests. And then eventually the regime gets to that point where it has to make a decision. Do we make concessions or do we crack down with all the world's eyes on us? So that was the main thing that stood out to me.
So one interesting contrast which I have seen, because I've been doing I've spent a number of hours researching into it, that in November of 2024, in case of Pakistan, there was a huge protest. Perhaps 100,000 people entered Pakistani capital city of Islamabad from the north and from the west. But it didn't get much of a coverage in the international media. In case of Nepal, the moment the unrest happened, the international news agencies developed big stories, and the firing that the Nepalese police has fired upon the people. In case of Pakistan, there was firing. People believe that an indeterminate number of people died. All of that was not covered by the international media. Apart from BBC Urdu and one other media, there was no coverage of the Pakistani situation. Here there is a massive coverage, and immediately the Western embassies come into the picture. United States, United Kingdom, France, Japan, and all other countries. Why there is such a big difference between the two situations?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people have studied, and in varying forms. But I think it just comes down to, when you don't have an expert class, like let's say, for example, whether national security professionals or intelligence professionals who work or have friendships with media outlets, when you have expert class, like for example, we know in the case of Pakistan, I think all of us here can name, maybe the 2 or 3 Pakistan experts in the entire United States, and a lot of them are sharing it with other issues. No, there are experts, but they're all in the counterterrorism focus. They're not going to be following the democracy movement. So when there's the lack of that conversation, nobody's telling the media, the reporters, hey, this is a story you should be covering. I mean, you're missing this, right? So it kind of self-reinforces. If no one's talking about it, the media doesn't cover it. And I think ultimately, there is of course, interplay with, there's going to be fewer experts covering an issue when that issue is not really in the interest of, essentially the lobbies in Washington, right? I mean, when you have defense think tanks, if there's a defense think tank that could see it in their interest for a democracy movement to succeed, because currently, let's say that government is currently buying Chinese hardware, and if there's a change, they'll be buying US hardware. Well, the think tank money will go to that. Then those think tanks help contribute to reporters covering it. So I think it's a part of a system. It's, I think it largely could be, it's not terribly different from kind of the theory that Noam Chomsky put out, which is the manufacturing consent theory, and the way that media is shaped indirectly in the West. I think that largely explains it.
Hussein, feel free, both of you. I would just want to remind both of you that feel free. Don't necessarily have to wait for my question. You should feel free if you think that you have an idea and you want to jump in. Hussein, many in the Pakistan, as I mentioned earlier, feel that why such a change could not come in Pakistan. What do you think? What's the difference between Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan?
Okay, so I'm going to try to break this down, because it's been a very interesting debate going on social media around this. And a lot of blame goes around to the public that, the public is not courageous enough, or, they're cowards and they're not coming out. Look at how it's happening in Bangladesh and Nepal. But really, it's a lack of understanding, that it's nothing to be shameful for the public who has come out repeatedly. The youth in Pakistan has come out. I think the real shame is with the elite in Pakistan, the ruling elite in Pakistan, that has infested itself so deep into the system that, the monsters that the people of Pakistan are dealing with are 10x bigger than the monsters, the small-time monsters in Bangladesh and elsewhere. And I'll give you the reason why that's the case. I mean, straight up one, I think might be a little bit controversial, and I don't want to be too controversial on your platform, the last time exposure with us. But Pakistan is not a fully developed nation at the moment. It's nations are built over time. It's not a fully developed nation. And by that, I mean that, you have a very specific set of elite that has done a very deep elite capture, which basically means that the type of policies of divide and rule that was carried out by the British Empire, they took them to the T and implemented that as a governance model in the supposedly post-colonial state, which basically means that they have been practicing divide and rule across ethnic, religious, sectarian lines by its own self. You're creating an artificial chaos, layers of chaos, for the past 75 years of history. Now, the reason why you've done that is very interesting because that divide and rule policy, dividing Punjab with Pashtun, political party A with political party B, and then joining them together, that's something that the British did very well in India. Now, a lot of people trying to like shame Pakistan that they never rose up. I mean, it's very interesting. Who rose up against the British in in the whole of India, right? Most of the people actually were very much involved in the British government and the whole British India and all. So to my point is that, post independence, the army of Pakistan, the military has taken over that role of the crown, the political arbiter, which is above the politics. Now, that is where the Pakistan army sees itself above the politics, that we are beyond this. So, what we're going to do is that we're going to intervene anytime we feel that the public is coming out against party A or party B, we will intervene and we will reset the order so that the state or the status quo should survive. So there is a big element of the army which is not present in Bangladesh, which was not present in Sri Lanka, which was not present in Nepal. They came to maintain the order, but nobody is a political arbitrator. So the Pakistan army is a political arbitrator, which is very different, and which has
So
been
basically,
over the years.
what you're saying is, if I also bring in Eric into this, but basically, Dr. Hussain, what you're actually saying is that in Pakistan, when the public come out, they're actually facing the army. The Pakistani government is actually the state itself. The Pakistani government of Sharif and Zardari clan at the moment is merely a representative, is just for the optic purposes. In reality, it's the military that is running the show in Pakistan. But in case of Bangladesh and in case of Nepal, it was not the military. The military could have been an organ of the state. For instance, case of the Nepal, in case of Bangladesh, the military decided not to bail out the government of Sheikh Hasina, right? When there is a fiction of the junior officers writing the email and so on. But the military stayed away from the fray. It was Hasina with the police. Same thing happened in Nepal, that the military only came and imposed the curfew once the Prime Minister Oli had actually offered his resignation. The military didn't came in to defend the parliament or to defend the ministers' homes. Ministers were beaten on the road. The finance minister was beaten on the road. The Prime Minister's house was burned. Many ministers' houses were burned. So the military remained neutral. In case of Pakistan, it is the people versus the military.
That's actually true, and I'll give one qualifying point on that. That for the past 75 years or so, the military had integrated itself, and the public had tolerated that role because the public truly believed that the military is a counterbalance to the feudal class, the political class, the bureaucratic class. So every time there was a military dictator, the people would be happy because the Nawaz Sharifs and the Bhuttos, they were creating havoc on the day-to-day life. So the military would provide a balance, not realizing that actually the military was behind the whole time, behind the curtain. That really the veil lifted when the military came into clash with Imran Khan, expecting exactly the same kind of response that people would, be grateful and thankful. Well, that didn't really happen. So there is a new, I would say there is a new
Dynamic
twist in the script. Yeah. So the script has kind of changed, and the military didn't know really what to do. But there is another element of it, because when you talk about Pakistan, we really talk about the three A's, right? So the army I've talked about, which is counter-revolutionary. It has, it can fizzle out the revolutions at any point. Then there is the element of America. Now, if you look at how the America has played as well, it has been a source of support for status quo in Pakistan. So every time the people were out, it was the IMFs, it was the American endorsement that stabilized, gave a breathing room to the new dictator, be it Musharraf, be it Ziaul, be it Ayub Khan, or be it. And if you look at all the conversations in Pakistan, there is a general saying that the relations between US and Pakistan have been most stable under the military rule. Now, the reason why they were stable was because the US preferred having a military rule in Pakistan. So there is an element of stability, which is why the revolutions are hard to make it, because the breakdown of the state is kind of stopped by the international injections. And then there is third element, which is the Allah element, that the religiosity element has kind of put people on the kind of the religion being the opiate of the masses, that is kind of force people to pass on the bucket. Now, most of the people in Pakistan under the age of 30 and even over 30 are good family people who want to do job, have children. They don't want to get involved in bloody revolutions because they expect that the parties representing or the people representing or even the military representing would take care of that interest. However, that
I
hasn't
want
been
to see
the
the
case.
revolution from the television screen.
or from Twitter screen and all of that. And you can't really expect for them to come out when you know that,
Okay.
the people who are vested
So
with that are not
let
going to
me
be
let
in
me
there.
let me bring in Eric into it with a little bit of summing up. Eric says we can see 2 points actually stand out. One is this: the masses and the people or the youth in Pakistan, when they protest and come out, they are confronted directly by a state that is the army. So the people of Pakistan are having a confrontation with the military, which is the state. In case of Bangladesh and Nepal, this has not been the case. This is the point one. The second thing is that the external stakeholders, in case of Pakistan, the West and the United States, are aligned with the military. In case of Nepal, we see perhaps there is a strong India factor. There was a tug of war between the Chinese interest and the Indian interest, and India has been traditionally much more stronger, deeply entrenched because of economic ties, because of commercial ties, because of religion, Hinduism, sharing the educational links, the military links, the training links. So India is very deeply embedded, and China was trying to get in through the Prime Minister Oli. So the China has actually been thrown out. So there are three factors. Then one, that the Nepalese state was not a military state. Second, there is an external factor that actually was supporting the protesters. There is the India factor probably in this case. Any other thing that comes to your mind? Yes, Eric.
No, I think those are fascinating points, and I always love listening to the professor's analysis. I think that it's such a difference when you have in Pakistan such a military that is obviously incredibly well funded and has decades of experience in a range of contexts, and it definitely shows in how they manage crowds. I mean, I think what I did notice in the Pakistan protest that you referenced, which is like the march and is the way that they've learned to control these protests in a way that doesn't lead to these type of moments that Nepal had, which is a really tragic, violent response to protesters that only spurs on the protesters and galvanizes media coverage and really, I think led to an immediate escalation. And with the Pakistani military, I mean, I was impressed, frankly, with the way that they've managed to repress with, minimizing the amount of, really accounts of killing. They wait until a very strategic moment. They cut the lights, they get the cameras out, and then they evacuate people. And you have to rely on, they even arrive to the hospitals prepared to control what is reported about it. So you can see it's a well-oiled machine, the Pakistani military. And, there's really, I think, few regimes that are so good at that while being so bad at some of the basic stuff such as like governance or economics. So it's incredible. It's such a stark difference. But I will say they are very good at managing protests in a way that limit those type of events that lead inevitably to an escalation and potentially a revolution.
Hussain, what actually Eric is referring to, I think that after the 1977, 1969, 1971, and 1977 mass movements, the Pakistani civil military bureaucracy has developed a specialization and a particular skill set as to how not to let the bigger crowds develop. So they actually attack while the crowds are developing from the streets. They don't let a few thousand people assemble at one point. I mean, PTI has done a miracle by bringing thousands of people from KP, but they were able to bring it from another province where they were governed. Otherwise, in Punjab, the civil military bureaucracy has never allowed people to collect at one point. They actually start attacking them even when they're just 40 people or 50 people. So this is what Eric is referring to. The Pakistani coercive apparatus is very well developed, whereas it fails repeatedly in terms of providing good governance, economic governance, or a sense of direction to the country. But it's actually very good in terms of the coercive, in terms of the subjugation of the people.
I think, yeah, I want to trace it back to why I think that is the case. I mean, it's easy to look now and commend Pakistan for to be able to control these protests and never having a revolution. But if we push back a little bit 50 years, the only country in South Asia that actually had fragmented or balkanized is actually Pakistan. There was, from the Bangladeshi point of view, there was a revolution, kind of like that was led by the Mujibur Rahman, and Pakistan eventually had a split. So Pakistan military establishment did learn its lessons from that, and the lessons learned were actually not one of the best lessons learned, because even if you look at Pakistan right now, despite the fact that we say that the military is able to control the chaos and all of that, but really it's not able to control the chaos. Large swaths of Balochistan are not under your state rate. There is no control. Most of the borderlands Balochistan and the KP are still, the smuggling is rampant over there. So there is a the element of porousness over there. And then there is like TTPs and all of that, which you're fighting. The state is constantly in that mode of survival. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be very much, I'm going to give them the agency that they've been controlling things very well. They've not been able to control things very well because it's not a state that looks very much under control. Control looks very different, where things are done in a very smooth way. Over here, things are being done in a very brutish way. So I'll twist back to a little bit point after the 70s because two things really happened since that period. One is Pakistan deeply entrenching itself in the geopolitical space. Pakistan's geopolitical relevance, that's a card that it uses. And over the time period, it developed another card, which was the N card, the nuclear card. Now, for instance, the difference between Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Pakistan is that Pakistan is a nuclear power. And when you look at the foreign states that look at Pakistan as an important geopolitical place, which has an additional problem of, extremism and an additional problem that is a nuclear power. So the metrics over in the geopolitical space kind of allows the Pakistan's ruling elite to perpetuate its own existence and survival because nobody wants to get embroiled into a mess of nuclear kind of like that. And then there is another element, and the last point on that is how the ruling elite in Pakistan has self-sabotaged itself. It's like, you sip up poison every single day to develop your resilience in case if anybody tries to, poison you. Classic Rasputin style. So what these guys have been doing is that they've been creating artificial chaos, Balochistan, TTPs, this, that, TLPs. And that has kind of like created a sense of survival within the state and society where people are not willing.
Summing it up, Hussain, you're saying that Pakistani ruling elite, the civil military, have actually learned to create so many sub-national crises in Balochistan and KP and so on, that actually keeps their base power in Punjab and Sindh worried about the future of the state, So they keep on throwing up the specter of conflict with India, the insurgency in Balochistan, the threat from Afghanistan, there's a threat in Fatah, so that, the people are always worried about the survival of the state.
So you're exactly right. The concept really is that rule by chaos. So anytime you are faced with a chaos, what do? You don't solve it. You create another chaos and another chaos and another chaos. That's like the past 50 years of Pakistan's history. Before that, before the 71, it was different. It was strategic plans, 5-year plans, and you were building Bangla dams and all of that. But since Bangladesh, actually, Pakistan has been moving from one chaos to another chaos to another chaos. Now that is not sustainable, and it has not been sustainable. We've had MQM, Mahajir whole issue in Sindhi in Karachi. We've had the whole tribal belt on fire for the past 2-3 decades. Same with Balochistan. And now in AJK and GB, there are new fires that are erupting. So to me, when I look at the situation in Pakistan, sure, it doesn't have the same mobilization of public like Nepal or Bangladesh. And part of the reason is Pakistan is a fragmented society. There is no concept of nationhood in Pakistan. Pakistan is a conglomerate of many, many nations that do not really subscribe to the very singular idea of freedom against a particular entity. They all have their grievances and they're all fighting in very different ways. You may not see a united front in Pakistan, but because the united front is actually much better because you can isolate it, you can control it. What we're facing is, a death with 1,000 cuts. There are so many fronts open across the board, from Generation Z to the TTPs to the BLAs in their own language they're speaking, and that's where I think Pakistan is going to go through a different cycle of state collapse, which may not look the same way, but surely it will go through because the variables and the data is all there.
So, Eric, Dr. Hussain sees a chaotic Pakistan that has so many different fighting zones within it. But in the recent weeks or months, we have seen that the United States administration of President Donald Trump seems to be pivoting away from India and is pivoting towards Pakistan. When I was speaking to Professor Steve Hankey of the Georgetown University a few days ago, and he made a very characteristic, very interesting observation. He says he sees a sort of a pivot away from Delhi towards a pivot towards Pakistan. Do you also see that something like that is happening?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I think all of DC and actually I think across the world, people are noticing this dynamic. I mean, it's been the subject of basically a sense of panic in DC with the amount of articles written about how Trump, what he's doing is unstrategic. it's been really incredible, and it's because India was the core of obviously the U.S. strategy to build up a counterweight to China, and they had a very well-defined plan that was backed by both parties to build this IMEC corridor from Europe to India, uniting the Middle East and keeping China out. And this is it's really quite an impressive plan. I mean, it's a bold plan. It needs a lot to go right, but this was their best plan for for being competitive with China's economic advance. And so I think DC is very, very worried. On the Pakistan front, it's hard to know with Donald Trump. I think everyone has speculated what is fully causing this. Is it, India's failure to congratulate him and call for the Peace Prize, or is it, there could be a range of different things that are causing. Is he using it temporarily to try to secure wins from India? But yeah, I think it doesn't appear to be a very deeply held belief. I think it's, certainly we have people in the State Department who were working hard to make this connection between Trump and the Pakistani regime, and it appears for the time being that have been successful. But I don't think anyone in Washington is going to assume that that's, especially when you look at the type of promises that the Pakistani regime has made, which are not serious promises. They're going to sound good to someone like Trump, who's really happy to have officials who are going to be telling him what he wants to hear, which is that there's oil for you, there's minerals for you, we're investing in crypto, working with relatives of, so that's what he wants to hear. And as far as I could tell, this regime is one of the best at saying what people want to hear. But I don't think it's going to be a very lasting one, and it's the kind of thing that over time, short period of time, ongoing pressure here could shift, in my opinion.
Hussein.
So I'll try to answer it in a more theoretical way, which is there is a total collapse of institutional memory in the United States foreign policy for the past decade and a half, I would say. And unfortunately, what that means is that every new president that is going to come in is going to make the exact same mistakes over and over again. So every time, this isn't the first time that this is happening, and this is the U.S. foreign policy generally as well. And the most interesting part is, I would say, the most beautiful part is that the dictators around the world who have engaged with the United States or danced around the United States understand exactly these rupture points. That every time there is a change in the administration, there are certain moments of few months where there is an institutional memory completely wiped off. So at that period of time, if you can dance hard around the new president, you might be able to have some short-term wins till the new president finally figures out your game. And I think this has been done over and over so many times by the Pakistan's establishment that it is surprising to me that, the President Trump, despite being the second time, was able to, fall for it. But I don't think that they really fell for it. Look, Pakistan is a small-time player in a very large game. It is a player, though. You cannot discount that it is not a player. It does offer very important something which is needed by any president, and specifically for a president like President Trump, which is
what is that? Something very important. What is that?
Compliance, absolute compliance. So Pakistan can offer more than what you ask. If you're asking for 2 birds, we'll offer you 4 birds. If you're asking for a moon, we'll also bring in Mars and Jupiter with you. So that's the kind of thing that Pakistan is very good at, because you can make over promises. Because as Joseph and I really talked about it, it's not really the power of, so the exact words are, it's the power of promise that is more important than the actual deliverable. So when you make big promises, they create big narratives and big stories. And sometimes, when you're in situation of power, you're really on a short period. You know that if you're going to go for an oil mining or an oil rigging, the investments, that stuff takes about 7 to 10 years. You're not going to be here. But the power of launching it and the narrative that comes with, we've launched oil refinery, we've launched critical minerals, we've launched crypto stuff and all of that, whether there is any reality to it or not, which, by the way, is none. It does not exist. But when you launch it, it gives you a win instantly for the US president. It gives a huge endorsement and boost to the local, military establishment in Pakistan. So everyone is happy, everyone is good, till everything is not good, which eventually always come about. In 6 months' time, I would say, things start to shape up because the great promises lead to great, great setbacks as well. So I don't think this is a long-term thing. This is a short-term thing. and I believe you have my book as well, and talked a lot about this in my book, that it's a same script over and over and over again, and it's like the US and Pakistan has learned to dance with each other by not killing each other.
So, Eric, coming back a bit to Nepal, uh, 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 at a time, the change in Nepal when a pro-Chinese government has actually fallen has happened at the time, which is also can be seen as a victory for India. But this has happened at the time when Washington and India relationship seems to be strained, like it never happened in the last 25 years. So, is the fall of a pro-Chinese government of the Prime Minister Oli will be seen as a victory in Washington?
Well, just because Trump is currently, causing major, anxiety to spike here among the national security class, about with his treatment of India, it doesn't mean that people have given up on the entire project. I'm sure virtually everyone in Washington who was a believer in that is still pushing for that, is trying to right that ship. And so, I don't think that, I think people are still happy to see China be put in a less advantageous position, and I'm sure Trump is too, given that he's not in the best position after his kind of ill-fated trade war and how that's played out. So, I think, I think it's there's still a consensus, even if Trump isn't following it. There's still a consensus in Washington that doesn't shift just because Trump and his core advisors decide on a unique path that wasn't foreseen.
So moving a little bit away back to Pakistan, Hussein, two other factors, two other observations I have read people have been writing on social media. One is this, that if the kind of Bangladesh or the Nepal chain doesn't come in Pakistan, one big factor is Imran Khan himself, because he has become the central figure for any resistance. He was a former prime minister. His resistance actually was not an uncontrolled resistance. Every time the people came out, Imran Khan actually wanted to use his popularity as a sort of a bargaining point with the Pakistani establishment. He thought that if he'll bring out the people, he will put the pressure on the streets, the Pakistani establishment will bring to the negotiation table, and he can be the prime minister once again. But in case of Bangladesh and in case of Nepal, you see there is a totally different kind of out of control kind of change, in which you didn't know what will be the outcome, what will be the result. I mean, these outbursts have only destabilized a system. For instance, the Hasina has been kicked out, but Bangladesh has no clear sense of direction. Also, in case of Nepal, as of now, we don't really know that what kind of political setup is going to replace the Prime Minister Oli. But in case of Imran Khan, since Imran Khan becomes the central point, the people do not have the kind of energy that you see on Nepal and that you see Bangladesh. How would you react to this kind of observation or comment?
I think it's a very good point, and I agree to it as well. At least on some major points of the macro, I think I agree with that. That the presence of Imran Khan is an offering of hope that things can be solved in a more civil, in a more non-violent, and in a more political way. I do wonder that if Imran Khan is not in the picture, then how would this picture completely change? Because then the element of hope and trust is not going to be there. And I think the national security establishment in Pakistan is also very smart enough to realize that as much as a threat Imran Khan is to them, he's also one of the trump card that they have, which will be an exit card for them. So they want to make sure that he's not completely out of the picture, because between the institutional ego and the public madness, there's a very fine line, and that fine line I think is Imran Khan right now. Because if you take that line out, I think all bets are off, and then you might see very different kind of Pakistan that starts emerging. And I think there is a sort of delusion over there as well within the public intellectuals in Pakistan, that just because a revolution or outrage has not really happened, they believe that it's never going to happen. The Louis never thought the French people who took them as sun god would come out and put him on a guillotine, but they did. And same was with the Russian oligarchs and all of that. It does happen, and a lot of times it is not predictable. So I do think that Imran Khan is that element of stability that is keeping the balance intact, the status quo balance, or the balance of the state, I would say.
Because Eric, when you look at Bangladesh and when you look at Nepal, the kind of leadership that actually brings out the people is not a leadership that is known across the country or something, right? They're not big names, they're not familiar names. They're replaceable people. They're young people. They do not necessarily have a political ideology. They're just angry. They're just angry against the system. And even if the police and the law enforcement arrest them or detains them or makes them disappear, it's not going to basically destroy the momentum because they're not driving it. They're just momentary leaders. I mean, from a change point of view, a leader like Imran Khan is actually a sort of a gift to the Pakistan's military establishment because he provides stability. He tends to provide a sense of direction with which the military can negotiate.
Yeah, well, I mean, won't speak too much to the internal dynamics. I'm certainly he could have been a gift. It doesn't appear that he is at this point with him facing off pretty directly with the military leadership. But, I know this is an argument that a lot of the diaspora rightly wants to make to the legislators here in the United States, which is, this is the type of leader that you want in a country like Pakistan. I mean, this is, in essentially making the argument that change is going to come to Pakistan. And if you have to accept change in Pakistan sooner or later, within the next few years or at most a decade, this is the right leader to do it. He's a person who can unite the country, can tamp down, I think, threats from extremism while also appealing to, kind of the folks in the cities, the educated classes. So, this is an argument that definitely I think a lot of people wish Washington would understand. But, I think in the current Cold War framework, they are, more in more of an all or nothing type mentality where if it's not,
if this is the case as you described, that Imran Khan is the kind of leader Pakistan needs for change, why in the last 3 years the Washington has done literally nothing? I mean, in fact, it kept on helping through IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank. It has continuously sustained an unpopular regime, and it hasn't really talked or done anything for the popular man that is Imran Khan.
Well, I'm sure there's many different, many different reasons, but a major one, which I'm sure your viewers are well aware, is that there's a concern that he would take Pakistan to a more independent foreign policy at a time when Washington is very, as we've discussed, very obsessed with keeping people on side, dividing world into essentially two camps, and saying if you're friendly with China and Russia, then you're an enemy of ours, instead of saying that it makes sense for countries to have diplomacy, particularly, and have good relationships with countries in the region. That's not how Washington sees it at this time. They see it as pretty zero sum, and they see it as also, that there's not a lot of time in their view. They believe China is growing very quickly. They believe they have a limited amount of time to slow that progress, to isolate China. And I think in the view of people in Washington, to have an independent Pakistan that is, friendly with China and Russia, even if it remains friendly with the United States, that's too much for them to stand. So, but it's unfortunate because, of course, I think we're all worried of what would happen if something were to happen to Imran Khan. You don't know what would come after this, and I think obviously it's reasonable to be concerned about the type of chaos or extremism that could result. So I think it's a very short-sighted thing on the part of Washington, but a lot of people, including the diaspora, are helping educate people in this city about that.
I want to add one more point on that, which is related to the approach of the current administration in the US, which is essentially around one thing: who can offer me a better deal. So it's really literally about the deal, a very short-term crisp deal. Now, if you look at in this situation in Pakistan, for instance, Imran Khan has nothing to really offer. What can he offer in terms of a deal that would be lucrative? Would we be able to offer US military bases for the oversight in China and Afghanistan? No, he's already said absolutely not on that. Can he offer any support on US Middle East problems, Iran? Absolutely not. He's never going to go on that. So what really can he tangibly offer for a very quick US interest? Nothing. Now, on the flip side of that, the military and the state has everything to offer. You want cryptos? Here you go. You want critical minerals? Here you go. You want, anything else with that? So for the Trump administration, if you're in the White House, sure, you love Imran Khan, you like him, he's a great guy and all of that. The people around you also like him, and you have a public pressure as well. But you might also be thinking that, I need quick wins right now to demonstrate that I've achieved something. And here is a guy who's told my entire staff and everybody that we're not going to be participating or we're not going to be giving you anything. And the other side, sure, they're dictators, they're worse to human rights abuses and all, but they're ready to offer you a Nobel Peace Prize. They're ready to offer you a win on the India and Pakistan relations front and everything that you can possibly imagine. So very quick, small gains. And this goes back to the same original point I was talking about, that the ruling elite of Pakistan has cracked the presidency, the US presidency, on what do they really want? What would a new president really want? And I think these guys, because of the institutional memories of dealing with successive US presidents, one by one institution in Pakistan that has dealt with about 50 US presidents since God knows when, they know exactly what would work.
Very
Imran Khan, on
interesting
the other hand, I
observation.
don't
I
think
think you have raised a very interesting question. I think, Eric, you really need to grapple with this question, that what can the Pakistani American community and people who want Imran Khan to be brought out of the jail, what can they really offer? What's a quid pro quo? What can Imran Khan offer to the American administration? Military has everything to offer.
meme coin.
Yeah, this is certainly one of the challenges. I mean, I think people who follow Imran Khan's movement, as far as I can tell, they believe in a sovereign Pakistan that, has an independent foreign policy, is not serving, maybe it's not as committed to the war on terror that cost, nearly 100,000 Pakistani lives. And I don't think anyone in the US, even now, it's very hard to defend that approach. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that really reduced terrorism, having this massive killing, the drone program. It's all been pretty much widely rejected by serious people in the US. So, but they haven't forgotten that he was opposed to it when they were really pushing it. So I think it's a huge challenge. But what I would say, and what I think is true, is that if you study Pakistan, me as an outside observer, it is clear that this particular system, it is not delivering. It's not even close to delivering. I mean, the performance economically, it's really, it's sad.
Why should Washington care? Why should Washington care?
What they should care is, you would rather get ahead. If you want to build a long-standing relationship with a country like Pakistan, don't cling to this rotting, dying regime till the last moment, so that when that change comes, everyone says you were on the other side. Show, the smart thing to do here would be to say, let's get on the side of democracy. Let's build a genuine partnership. And that way, when that change does come, there's a real incentive and there's a goodwill on the part of the people and on the part of any Democratic person they elect to do that. But I think the hope in Washington, people still believe what we hear from the regime officials, certainly, which is that they hope and believe it can go back to how it was. They can go back to managing it, switching between regime-backed parties, and the people will forget about Imran Khan, forget about democracy. And I think the challenge is showing them that it's not going to go back.
But Eric, your assumption is the theoretical assumption that the Pakistan's military regime somehow or other is collapsing. Maybe the people inside the Trump team do not necessarily see that. An important Pakistani a few weeks ago had a meeting with some highly placed member of the Trump team. And the Trump team member said to him that don't give us this appeal of democracy, because Pakistan has never been a genuine democracy. And it's always been under the pressure of the West that it looked like a democracy. You don't really have any internal desire for democracy. And why should we be spending our political capital to support democracy or push democracy in a country which has no real desire for democracy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess someone could argue that, but I think it's pretty clear that people have a hunger for democracy there. I think that's been made clear by all the polls and all of the movements that we've seen. So, I think they want that to be true. That's something that definitely State Department officials will say. The military will always be in charge there. But unfortunately, just the economics of the situation, it just is pretty much a matter of time before people will demand a government that, actually has competitive, dynamic industry and isn't just run by this military elite that essentially controls a lot of the major industries and parcels things out. It's just not going to be sustainable.
Look, in the last 24 hours, the Pakistan's democracy movement has a huge setback in Washington. When Congressman Jim McGovern of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, the co-chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, had made a very reasonable proposal of amendment, that Amendment 492 in the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, which actually demanded that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense should certify that there are steps being taken to uphold the rule of law, and human rights, and also that no civilians are being tried by the military courts. And that was a very reasonable sort of amendment. But on the contrary, a very toothless amendment, which has absolutely no meaning in my eyes. I'm very surprised at how Congressman Joe Wilson had proposed that kind of amendment of 300 days, that after 300 days, the Pentagon will probably initiate a process. And that toothless, useless amendment has been adopted by the Rules Committee of the House, which is a clearly setback for the democracy movement of Pakistan. How do you look at that?
Yeah, I wouldn't quite say it's a setback because, to be clear, Congressman McGovern's amendment, if it were allowed to vote, it would have been the most significant vote in Congress in the history of U.S.-Pakistan relations. It would have, for the first time, had on the floor of the House the question of having human rights conditions before more training is given. So, yes, obviously, I think we would have loved to have the most historic, significant vote in the history of the relationship over 70 years, but it was still the fact that Congressman Wilson, who's essentially a hawk, he is deeply connected to the establishment here in Washington and is not someone you typically would expect to be in any way an ally. But the fact that he felt pressured after that was introduced to introduce his own amendment. Yes, it says in 300 days, the Pentagon should submit a strategy about raising the issue of political prisoners like Imran Khan. Well, I think all of us know it's already been about 700 days that he's been locked up. So another 300 is pretty sad to think about that idea. That said, it also does acknowledge that Imran Khan is a political prisoner, and that amendment is now going to pass the House. So even though it's way less than what the movement should have and what it deserves and what would make sense, it still is going to represent the first time the U.S. Congress is going to vote to say that Imran Khan's a political prisoner. And of course, that's just a building block. But yeah, so I wouldn't say it's just a setback, but I think for everyone in this movement who cares about changing U.S. policy and so
how do you look at the politics of the Congressman Joe Wilson over here? I mean, what is he trying to achieve?
Yeah, well, I think that's an open question. I mean, I think he appears to be genuine, and we all have seen he's tweeted out "Free Imran Khan" many times, more than maybe even any of us have tweeted it out. So that should mean something. That said, this type of proposal, it could be a genuine attempt to find a moderate proposal that will pass the House. Or it could also be, an attempt to, keep activism within a certain realm. Because what we really need, I think, people who have studied, the U.S.-Israel relationship or any of these relationships, what we need is to use U.S. leverage to effectuate change. And we know that if the U.S. said, hey, if you want this training, you have to do this. Pakistan military is going to is going to go through, really put in a lot of effort to try to make that happen. They're not going to give up that training that brings them so much esteem, so much professionalism. It's very important to them. We know that because the Pakistani military, their representatives in Washington were furious about this amendment, just the proposal of it. So, which is what we heard through. So that is the key is while whatever his intentions are, the diaspora needs to make clear that the thing that matters now is whether the U.S. is going to use that leverage to make the change, because we know that if the U.S. says, we'll give you the training either way, it's effectively a green light for the regime to keep doing what they're doing.
Okay, just winding up the discussion, Hossein, how do you look at this, the Joe Wilson thing?
I echo Eric on this. I think these are long games. So you win a little every time. There is no clear, victory or, defeat in this. And let me also add this thing that, this is not the first time the amendments have been done. Under the Kerry Lugar-Berman Act, the U.S. Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense were both supposed to provide certifications for the disbursement of aid. And they did, by the way. And there was a long list of U.S. supporting democracy, U.S. not doing this, U.S. not doing this. And even in programs like the Pakistan Army supporting democracy and all of that. And even have this, specialized training for military officers in Pakistan on democracy hosted by the U.S. So that have been there. The administration can really easily, certify it and get on with it. But these things are kind of narratives. And these are, signaling. So I think what we need to really understand by the Joe Wilson's amendment, sure, it's not that, very, aggressive and all of that, but it's also very clear, the mention of Imran Khan. And as Eric pointed out, that, acknowledging that he's a prisoner of conscience and the political prisoner, that I think itself is a very
So
big
is Joe
statement, in my
Wilson,
opinion.
after discussion with some stakeholders, has decided to give the Pakistani establishment another 300 days to keep Imran Khan in jail, and then we will see? Is this what the game is?
I think I don't know what the game is exactly. I think they already know. But I think this is there is a problem. This is a signaling part that we would. This is the side where we stand. That we're giving you a breathing space. We're giving you room to fix the things, and that's, from what I understand, is also the message of the current administration to the military establishment in Pakistan, that you have time to fix things. And if I think message kind of resonates with Joe Wilson's amendment as well, that try to do the right thing. So I don't think that they want to say. And if you look at the Pakistan
300
US
days. I
history,
mean, but Eric, Imran Khan is in this October, Imran Khan will turn 73, and he's already in jail from 5th August 2023. So it's well above more than 2 years. So had Congressman Jim McGovern's amendment passed, that would have compelled the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense to certify, or they would have actually come to the Congress and they would certify, we are in touch with the Pakistani government and the Pakistani military has promised us to make progress on the human rights. They're not going to try any more civilians in the military courts. I mean, they are about to. They want 3 months for settling the issues of the political prisoners. Things would not have necessarily happened in one single day. But by giving 300 days, it looks like that Congressman Joe Wilson was in touch with certain stakeholders who said we need time, and another 1 year, almost 300 days have been given to them for fix things up. I mean, this is how I interpret. So I mean that's why I use the word setback. I mean, if you look at the language of the Congressman Jim McGovern of the Human Rights Commission, the Tom Lantos Commission, and the language that has been adopted by Joe Wilson, there is a huge difference. I mean, yes, of course, word Imran Khan has been used there. I mean, what else has been achieved?
Well, it's also a process of essentially connecting with the right offices, showing the level of seriousness of the advocacy movement. And this is not going to be a one-off thing. We actually have many other bills coming up. We have the state authorization bill, which would be perfect to look at whether Pakistani human rights violators should be getting visas. We have that's another bill that can be looking at the financial sanctions so that the Pakistani regime officials can't store their corrupt wealth in Western financial systems. So there's many other approaches. We're going to find many other opportunities where they have found a very mild proposal that buys time. But by continuing this process, both gaining experience with all the advocates who are involved, and also connecting and educating with the members of Congress. Some of them, obviously, their top priority is going to be to maintain that relationship. Others there are increasing people who, as they meet Pakistani Americans, they realize this is just an untenable situation, and they're going to come more towards the pro-democracy side of things. So, I think there's many opportunities for in the coming months to step up the pressure.
Thank you so much, Eric. Eric, thank you so much. And Dr. Hussain, thank you so much. In this discussion, we can clearly see that the similarities between Nepal and Pakistan are simply not there. Pakistani political system, situation, power structure is very different from that of Nepal, and there were external stakeholders that had an interest in political change in case of Nepal, which are totally absent in case of Pakistan. And also, we looked at the political situation within Washington. Let's see how the cookie crumbles. Thank you so much.